translation, and Eugenio Montelli from his Italian English dictionary. The title of her presentation today is In Memory of Mary Barnard.
And this is titled In Memory of Mary Barnard in the long line of translation. There's a longer version of the talk before Walter told me how much time I had. You're welcome to pick it up. And attached to it is a little flyer about what Mary's friendship brought to light. I want to thank you for the honor of the invitation. It comes to someone with no real academic affiliation. My affiliation with Mary Barnard was both brief and personal 53 years ago. So long ago, but lasting, a clear echo. Our acquaintance in the early 1970s came through the intercession of a young poet couple, Sandra McPherson and Henry Carlisle, who had just moved to the Pacific Northwest from the East Coast, where they had been students of Elizabeth Bishop. I had gone to interview them for the Reed College Literary Magazine. Sandy and Henry were quick to suggest that if I were serious, I needed to go next to visit Mary Barnard, if she would see me. They told me she had translated Sappho on assignment from Ezra Pound. She replaced H.D. in having to do the Greek translations. The Reed College connection might get my foot in the door. Reed was still looked upon by the young as a school for dreary drudges because there were no Greek letter sororities and no intercollegiate sports. And still viewed by parents, including mine had they known, as extremely dangerous, radical, non-denominational, and the principal subjects taught were atheism, communism, and free love. Yes, I wanted to go meet this Mary Barnard. Curious, because I had heard the name Sappho breathed, and had been assigned bits of Pound and Eliot in our writing class earlier. Memorable, as the one class 6 of us had failed to get into, because based on our submitted manuscript applications, we could not write. How else to interpret the posting of a list that our names were not on? Why had I thought submitting my family's backwoods Arkansas anecdote would be a sure ticket into great literature? My family were inadvertent cannibals, having eaten, along with most of the town of Hope, part of a frontier man's wife he had butchered and passed off as fairly. What had the rest of us submitted as works? I forget, but I remember we consulted each other. We tripped as a group to administration, putting our case that at $5,000 tuition a year, we were entitled to learn what we liked. We had already begged Kathleen Fraser, that year's visiting poet, we said. She was practically starving as an adjunct. She seemed quite willing to take us all on as a second class. You might say she and we had need of each other. We wanted to be writers. We were determined to read and listen and learn, since we knew we weren't good writers. We became that small, tight second class of 6 leftovers that produced at least 2 editing founders of small literary presses, a Time magazine journalist, and a couple more poets who each wrote all their lifetimes after undergoing the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Me too. During the later midwinter, I would step off a bus in Iowa midway through law school to start an MFA in poetry and finish a law degree there in the land of deep snows and tornadoes. But I grew into the poet and translator of Russian poets that I am in the rain and deep greenery of the Pacific Northwest because of Mary Barnard, led as I was informally, first by her grieving Ezra Pound that November, then by the bold example of her own independence, and always by her kind and continuing encouragement. Our first interview took place at her home on the Evergreen Highway, the low house with the 3 ponds behind it. At the doorway, Mary, who was tall, needed to bend her snowy white head down a bit to greet me, with her wide eyes enlarged by the lenses of her glasses. She explained cataracts to me. She was in her late 60s. To me, then a sophomore at Reed, she appeared a regal figure, self-contained, self-composed, nearly austere, whether at her full standing height or seated. Yes, well, come in. And I stepped into a clean, neat front room, readied by something having been baked, and into a whiff of steam. Mary served me pound cake and tea, and sat down to unweave her stories, to confide them, perhaps to rehearse them. Eventually, I learned much of what she later wrote down in her 1984 Assault on Mount Helicon, a literary memoir. How she wrote to Pound out of the blue as a young Reed graduate who had landed back home with her parents there in Vancouver during the Great Depression. How he had answered with a postcard from Paulo. Was she serious? When Mary assured Pound in turn that she was serious, he opened a lifelong, sometimes intermittent, correspondence and urged upon his friends a series of useful personal meetings for her. He had set Mary up as a small press poetry and manuscript curator at SUNY Buffalo's Lockwood Memorial Library after their first meeting in New York with Iris Berry during his 1939 Peace Mission to Congress. Yes, she had searched out William Carlos Williams' attic writing studio for old issues of Blast. As tall as she was, how did she get up the narrow stairs? She was younger then, no less eager then than when she recalled it. I had no car and didn't drive then. Really, I have no memory now of how I managed to get so often from Portland to Vancouver over the wide Columbia River, but I made many return visits by Mary's invitation thereafter, about every month. At her table, it seemed to me as though at Mary's feet, I listened to her accounts of Pound and of the poets he introduced her to, Dr. Williams at the attic, and Marianne Moore, nearly all the ones she later wrote down and dedicated to her young friends, fledglings in the forest of Helicon. I learned who James Laughlin IV was, and some of the history of New Directions. When all the other junior women in the writing class dropped out, one by one, after next year's visiting poet adjunct hit on each of them, Mary reinforced for me Marianne Moore's injunction to her that there is no need to be bohemian. After all, Mary had icily or deftly deflected William Carlos Williams' pass that time they taxied over the George Washington Bridge, and gone on to become a warm friend of the entire Williams family. Then Mary lay out all her own personal injunctions concerning the standing of women who aspire to write fine and lasting poetry. No surprise to learn later that Mary wrote to Germaine Greer a few years after our meetings. I would rather finish 15th in the Derby than first in a race for fillies only. she had taught me that lesson. To invoke Mary today, here is a single exquisite stanza from an early poem she placed at the end of her collected poems. The living will forget more quickly than I, dead, lingering with the lips unwet over Letha. Here is my favorite poem, one long stuck in my head, first published in the New Yorker in 1966 by editor John Asbury. It seems to be a full embodiment of her prose work in The Mythmakers, also from 1966, and perhaps a favorite of the poet herself. Maybe one of you would know. It is included in her time in the White Tigress, awarded the 1986 Western States Book Award for Poetry. Of course, this poem has been translated into Italian by Mary Rockowitz and published again with its translation here in Italy. So, an important poem to the poet, and one with many admirers. A poem of balanced lines and caesuras, with many enjambments, running first over line breaks and then over stanza breaks. The Pleiades. They are heard as a choir of 7 shining voices. They descend like a flock of wild swans to the water. The white wing plumage folds, they float on the lake, 7 stars reflected among the reeds. Tonight, the 7 little sisters, daughters of the moon, will come down to bathe or wash their summer dresses. They wear costumes of 7 rainbow colors. They wear feather mantles. They can lift in sea winds raised by their singing, and so rise, flying, soaring, until they fade as the moon dawns. Their voices dwindle and die out in the north woods, over Australian bush, from Spartan dancing grounds and African beaches. They have returned to the sky for the last time, and even Electra's weeping over Troy is stilled. What girl or star sings now like a swan on the Yellow River? This is all to say that to me, Mary Barnard was forthcoming and unfailingly kind. No recall that she ever asked, or that I ever offered, to show her any of the poems I was scribbling for my own creative thesis at Reed, one I knew to ask to be able to do, because she had set the precedent. Mary's kindness was warm and practical. When my parents could ill afford to come pick me up at graduation, Mary arranged to be there herself with a group of her closest friends to take me out to a celebratory dinner before I caught my bus out of Portland. By 1980, Mary was at work writing her Assault on Mount Helicon here at Brunnenburg. She and Mary de Rockowitz were friends for over 40 years. Mary Barnard was the first messenger from St. Elizabeth's to Mary de Rockowitz to tell her how her father was doing in Washington. Of course, she told me about Brunnenburg. Not just that it was a castle, not just that Pound's daughter lived there as a princess, but that the drop of the water from the wash basin out the high window of the tower was a long time falling silently before splashing on a pavement of stone. By that time, I had just survived the Iowa Writers' Workshop by slipping around a hallway corner to become a junior translator for the International Writing Program. And I had passed the bar. But Mary had already set me firmly on a parallel lifetime journey, alert to making poems and translations, alert to Joseph Brodsky, who visited Iowa in 1978 to offer up Anna Akhmatova's estimation of her younger contemporary, Marina Tsvetaeva. Well, if you are talking about the 20th century, Tsvetaeva is the greatest one in my view. The greatest poet in the 20th century was a woman. Here I hasten to add, Brodsky's personal affirmation of Akhmatova's praise was offered in the limited context of my own question from the floor about who might be the best poets among the untranslated Russians. As a long echo, it came well after Brodsky had translated some Pound for himself while a young poet exiled to the north. So, Brodsky's recall of Akhmatova's long ago claim, perhaps just the throwaway of an opera glyph, landed with me. It seemed to fit perfectly the shallow handholds of ambition in translation that Mary Barnard had pointed out earlier on the sheer walls of Helicon. And on my bookshelf stood her 1958 example of Sappho in continuous print to this day, unusual for translation. In my head, always, my absolute favorite of her translations for what it said about Mary herself and her familiarity with the Oregon coastlines. If you are squeamish, don't prod the beach rubble. That's Sappho, and that's Mary. So my aim would be to produce an accurate, modernist version of Marina Tsvetaeva that would not be painful or awkward for a speaker of American English to read. Now, I am no natural linguist. To haul myself above Helicon's tree line, I needed to look up every word in my Oxford Russian English dictionary and note each meaning and every idiom in which it was reported to be used. This part of translating holds the same attraction for me as crossword puzzles do for other people. It's like knitting or doing tax returns. It produces the high calm of number or word intoxication. It kept me calm as I waited in many courthouse libraries for my cases to be called. Guided by my early talks with Mary and by the readings of Pound, she suggested to me, I hope to gain by osmosis a sure feeling for the texture of the Russian language. Tsvetaeva had chosen the texture, if you will, of her diction. String the words together in line, put the lines into a stanza, diagram any grammar, just as I had done with my English sentences in grammar school. Put the stanzas in order. Only then could I even read a whole poem, reeled up out of the depths of Russian, begin to think about it, or feel what it meant, and then revise it, each word with the others, each line with what became before and after, stanzas in order as a whole poem, one both sensible and emotional. By then I could take heart recalling how Mary had made as many as 40 revisions to longer poems and tiny fragments of Sappho she had finally translated so clearly. Now I'm going to reread the example of a translation that I was able to do because of some of Mary's principles that she gave to me and that she pounded into me, and because of what Pound had written about the differences between word order in English and inflected languages. This is Tsvetaeva. So you will never find me in this life with a sharp and invisible fence. I encircle myself, with honeysuckle bind myself, with hoarfrost cover myself. So you will never hear me at night with a crone's subtlety, with reticence. I fortify myself, with rustlings bind myself, with silkiness cover myself. So you neither flower nor mold in me overmuch in my undergrowth. In my books, I mislay, I bury you alive, with fabrications bind you, with any pretense cover you. This is a love poem to her publisher, who was married at the time, as was she. Thank you.
Again, if you would like the longer version, there are copies here for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our